Chysis limminghei is one of the cutest little orchids ever. These colors are just so beautiful. I know you'll want one of these in your home. So let's teach you how to grow these properly. We'll go through a culture sheet that will give you all the information you need so that you'll be able to get success with your Chysis limminghei, or as Americans know it, Chysis. And welcome to the Nature Company. If this is the kind of information you're interested in, please hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and that notification bell to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. So let's just have a quick look at the plant itself. We notice it has these big, fat, large back pseudobulbs that it produces, and then the new leaves are on the new growths. And if you notice, it flowers off the new growth that is being produced. This is how most of the Chysis produce their flower spikes, is off that new growth that's coming out of the old pseudobulbs. They are semi-deciduous and will only generally keep their leaves for 2 years, but then you'll only get them to stay on the plant if your conditions are absolutely ideal, because often even in their natural environments they'll lose their leaves during the winter times. In general culture, it will lose its leaves during the winter period, so you'll end up with just the back bulbs and you will wait for the new growths to come. This Chysis limminghei, it flowers in late summer to early autumn. Some of the other Chysis you might find flowering in early spring. They're relatively easy to manage, especially because they do tend to lose their leaves. It makes that winter period relatively easy to give them rest, because you know that you're not going to have to water them terribly much. All you want to do is make sure you don't allow those bulbs to shrivel. So you can almost reduce your watering right down and stop feeding altogether. Also, because their leaves are so papery thin, you know they're going to burn easily. So keep these out of direct sunlight. That will just burn straight through these papery thin leaves, and your poor plant isn't going to have a chance to build up all that energy to be able to produce the new growths and flowers that you're looking for. You'll also notice with the Chysis, jumping between these names, you'll also notice between the Chysis that they generally have plicate leaves, which is that little bit of almost pleating in the leaf. And so let's look at these growing conditions a bit closer. Give them a nice bright diffuse light without any direct sunlight hitting it, and you can actually move it at times to somewhat lower light conditions. But the one thing is that they do need at all times is heavy air movement. They need a constant air movement around them, otherwise you do tend to get all sorts of problems with the roots dying and rot forming and things like that. So you need to ensure that they constantly have good air movement around them. Their watering requirements, they are relatively thirsty, especially while in active growth. So you want to keep them moist but not damp. So you're going to be watering these really quite frequently. They, I suppose you could say, semi-terrestrial to epiphytic. So if you're using a peat mix, as long as you're getting it really, really well drained and you're not overwatering, it should be okay. What I use is these coir fibers, and that's all that I plant this into. I keep quite a heavy feeding regime while it's in growing phase, because they are quite heavy feeders to be able to produce all these back bulbs that they're going to need to store over winter. So as the new growth comes, they've got this energy stored up for them to really produce all those new bulbs and lots of those flowers. Other media that can be used is bark. A medium sized bark is actually relatively good for them. You can use a charcoal. You can use just your plain coir chunks, or of course you could go with a mix of them all. So just as long as you're making sure that they get that good drainage, but still retaining some moisture. During that growing phase, they do like a lot of water around them. And then again, as they go more dormant towards that winter without the leaves, you can start withholding that water and possibly even if it starts to get too cold, stop watering altogether. But one thing about them is they do like relatively high humidity levels. A 70% humidity is ideal for them. These fine papery thin leaves can dry out relatively quickly when it's pretty dry in the air. So rather keep your humidity levels around them so we can keep these leaves healthy. It's one of the reasons that I like to use this coir fiber mix, is because as the water evaporates from it, it keeps that humidity level around it, but it still allows for lots of air around the roots to allow them to not be soggy. Also, they do extremely well mounted, but then again, you're going to have to manage your watering better. So watering a mounted Chysis is probably going to be daily, if not twice daily watering during those active growth periods. And the bowl that I particularly like to use is a hanging basket. These hanging baskets, they come with a reservoir beneath. So I don't use this reservoir to store water. I remove the plug from the back so that the water can drain out freely, and it can have basically that air gap at the base of the pot, so that when the water drains freely from the media, it's not staying stagnant there, and it can get that air movement directly up from the base as well, so those roots don't rot away. Also, you'll find with their roots is they're fairly clingy, so they'll attach themselves onto just about any surface quite easily, which makes mounting pretty easy. And when you want to subdivide your plant or you want to propagate it, the easiest way is once it has gone dormant, and again, if you're in suboptimal conditions, all the leaves have fallen off, then you can just take these back bulbs and plant them up. Best to do it in 3s or 4s, but I must admit I have had the single odd bulb that has come off that I've planted up separately and been very successful in getting new plantlets out of it. Feeding, they also relatively heavy feeders during the growing season, but then again in winter, because they go dormant, you can almost cut your feeding out completely during those winter periods. So feed them heavily during spring and summer, and then taper off in autumn and stop completely in winter. You're going to be using either a balanced fertilizer right the way through, or as I prefer to do with everything, is using an organic liquid fertilizer that I spray on the whole plant itself and douse into the media. This I'll do every week during the growing season. Then in autumn, I'll reduce that down to maybe once a month. And then again in winter, just pretty much ignore them completely. So we've been through light, water, media, temperature. The temperature always an important thing. These come from Central to South America, often found in and about sea level all the way up to about 1,000 meters, and they generally come from intermediate zones. So for an intermediate orchid, you're generally looking at lows of around 10 degrees Celsius to highs of about 30 degrees Celsius, which is about 50 degrees Fahrenheit to about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So they have a fairly broad temperature variation that they can manage, and it is often found that even if you don't give them terribly much variations in your temperatures, they can still bloom quite successfully. So unlike some of the other ones that you have to make sure you get those big temperature changes, often with Chysis, they'll just automatically bloom anyway. And if you're wanting to keep constant temperatures around 21 degrees or 70 degrees Fahrenheit is a fairly comfortable range for them to be able to live through without causing any problems or affecting the flowering at all. The one thing about Chysis is they don't particularly like their roots being disturbed. So try and put them in a media like I do. This coir fiber, which really doesn't decompose quickly at all. It can take several years before it even starts looking like it needs to be repotted. So try and make sure that you're only repotting every 2 or 3 years at a maximum, so that we're not disturbing it too much. And one thing about them, with these big heavy back pseudobulbs, I've found they've been extremely hardy. So even been neglected for 2 years and they've still come back and flowered without a problem. So these tough little beauties are definitely something you should look at getting into your collection. The sort of waxy flowers last an incredibly long time, and to me it's just pure joy. Those colors are just spectacular. So Chysis, 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 doesn't really matter. We all love our orchids. We might not understand what you're talking about, but when we see it, we do. So before I keep this poor orchid in the sun any longer and damage its tender little leaves, let me move it off to the shade and finish up here. And before I forget, one of the reasons this makes such an amazing indoor orchid is because of its tolerance to those slightly lower light conditions and the fact that its blooming isn't going to be disturbed by those constant room temperatures that you may have indoors if you could controlling your temperatures for the heat and for the cold. So there's always one to keep an eye out for. You may not necessarily like the look of the plant when it's just in that buck bulb form, but when it's in full flower, who can deny that? And if you find any of this information helpful, please hit that like button. It helps us greatly. Hit that subscribe button down below if you haven't already, and that notification bell, bing bong, to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss a thing. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow. And also, one thing about Chysis is they don't Chysis. The one thing about Chysis